Uh, well, Hi, folks. I'm Jeff Ritter. I want to thank Mandy and Roseanne and Katie for inviting me to talk today. I'm an attorney who practices special education and disability law. I did my first due process hearing when I was probably back in 1997. So I've been doing this for a little bit. I have a law firm in Pittsburgh where all we do is primarily handle special education and disability rights issues. And we handle cases all around the state. I was talking to Mandy and the team earlier today about my Scranton connection. My dad's from Scranton. I grew up going to Naog Park and eating Brutico's pizza, which as I understand, might be gone now. Is Brutico's gone? Yeah, people are nodding. Yes, I'm sad about that. But understand that I'm really delighted to be talking today to everybody, especially about this topic. Absenteeism and school refusal has really turned out to be a really complicated issue post-pandemic. Um, Parents and districts have a lot of conflict about this issue. Um, I'm going to share with you some of the things that we've sort of figured out to help address these complicated situations. I have to acknowledge a couple of things. I work for parents and who are concerned about their kids. I come from a place of, I have a bias, a professional bias through the work that I do. I try to acknowledge my bias. I try to be clear about it. But I also like to talk about like part of my bias is my parents were both teachers as well. And so a lot of so while I'll come from it from a parent perspective, and sometimes this is an adversarial process, I think the one of the things that made me want to get into this area of law was hearing my dad, who was a special education teacher, talk about sort of things that went wrong and how schools don't take care of kids. And what we found is that, people working in good faith, even if you're working for the district, you're working for a parent, you're working from another organization, if you're working in good faith, these issues can generally resolve themselves without too much of a conflict. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to talk about today is how we can address these sort of complicated issues and stop them from getting too elevated. Um, this is if we can move on to the next slide. The scope, so this is a complicated issue. Okay, this is initially was presented as a training for advocates, and this is so we're talking about some advanced issues. I am happy to make things more complicated or less complicated as folks want. We only have around 20 participants. This is a very informal conversation. If you have questions that are particular to your situation, or if I want you to either reach out in the type or reach out and type in the chat box uh, or interrupt if there's ways of doing that. I'm not working the controls, but understand, my goal is to make this valuable for you. Everybody took time out of their day to talk about this issue. I want to make sure it's valuable. So please don't be shy about interrupting or asking things if this isn't clear to you. I want to give everyone in this room something that they didn't have before and the ability to walk away with some information that's valuable and meaningful for them when they're talking about this important issue. Okay, so this is an advanced training, and I talked about that before. I'm going to be talking about some in-depth issues. Push me one way or the other if I go too deep or if I'm not going deep enough. The interesting thing about this is that I'm seeing typos, which break my heart. There are advocacy opportunities presented in truancy and school absenteeism issues, that there are advocacy opportunities outside of IEP meetings, and that's sort of a little bit unusual for some advocates and for some parents. Um, this is a really in-depth issue, and I'm not going to be able to sufficiently cover this stuff in depth. And what I think is generally useful is I'm giving a list of resources, and I think generally what Mary Lou Whitus is here. She's the outreach coordinator from our office. She will send out the documents that we're talking about and make sure that everyone who wants to look at these has access to them. But understand that this is a really in-depth problem, and there's a lot of resources available. But the thing I really want to do is give everyone access to this book, which I've found to be particularly important. It's Christopher Carney, and it's spelled Kearney. And it's a book called Helping School Refusing Children and Their Parents, a Guide for School-Based Professionals. And I've got the link for it. The link for it. The next slide shows you what the title looks like. This is really cool because the idea on this book is that it talks about you read it today, you implement it tomorrow. This is not something that this is designed to be used by practitioners who are struggling with these issues. Whether or not these are all the solutions or proposals offered in the book, whether they work, that's again, I don't know whether we've had success with a lot of these interventions, and but the thing that we've sort of found is that his framework, Dr. Carney's framework for analyzing these problems, helps us address um, problems that are unusual for IEP teams to consider in many instances. School refusal traditionally has been looked at as being a mental health problem or a parenting problem. And it's only sort of recently that the courts have begun to explain that this is in fact a district issue, a FAPE issue, a free appropriate public education issue, and not just a child neglect truancy mental health issue that the parents are responsible for. So this book gives a framework for understanding school refusal, and it's also very practical in giving solutions. It's like $30 on Amazon, and once I found it, I've been recommending it to parents, I've been recommending it to advocates, and I think for anybody who's dealing with these issues, this is a really good resource. Carney runs a clinic, I think a school refusal clinic out of University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He speaks. If you ever get a chance to YouTube him speaking, he's a brilliant guy, and he's also really down to earth. He's not one of these academics who talks in gobbledygook. He's real, he's straightforward, and he offers very practical solutions. Um, if we can move on to the next slide. One of the cool things that Carney does is he sort of breaks down things that we all know. And if we work with kids with school refusal issues, he breaks things down that we already know into sort of a systematic way of looking at school refusal kids. And what he identifies is that there's really four reasons why kids avoid school. First one is to avoid school-related stress. This is kids who are this is about sometimes performance, regarding test anxiety, difficulties with the difficulties with just being in the school setting. The second one he identifies is to escape what he calls aversive social or evaluative situations at school. This is sort of the other recognition or thing that we recognize as professionals, is that sometimes social issues are the biggest reason why kids aren't attending. Um, it is There's a way that, and we're going to get into this later in the presentation, but Carney gives a really cool instrument, which is which is an evidence-based instrument that's been tested and appears to be uh, scientifically valid for identifying the causes of school refusal. So while he identifies these areas, he also gives you the tool to figure out which of these causes are most significant in a kid's school refusal behaviors. We talk about, he also talks about the third reason is to gain attention from their parents, which is kids who just don't want to leave home because they get reinforced they get reinforced positively and they don't want to transfer to a neutral or a negative situation. And then there's kids who miss school because they want to pursue tangible rewards, either because they want to, work or they want to hang out with their friends. This is sort of this fourth reason to pursue tangible rewards outside of school. This is sort of like when I was growing up, what people would call playing hooky, okay, where smoking cigarettes on the corner with your friends while you were supposed to be in algebra. That is sort of recognized too as being a another reason for school refusal. The reason I have those asterisk stars there is because that's sort of a little bit outside, in most instances, what we do in terms of advocating for disability related reasons. But what we found is that avoiding school related stress, escaping aversive social situations, gaining attention from parents, a lot of these are related to anxiety or anxiety related disorders. And so I sort of, those top three, those are the ones that I'm primarily going to talk about. And those are the ones I think we primarily talk about as professionals or when we're advocating for kids. The reason why the understanding why why kids refuse school is also super important because different reasons for school refusal require different interventions to address them. Okay, for professionals here who are advocates or for parents who are familiar with behavioral support, the closest thing I can compare this to is for a functional behavioral assessment. You have to understand the function of the behavior before you can program for the positive PBSP, for the positive behavioral support plan. It's sort of the same thing. There's a lot of reasons why kids decide not to go to school. If you misidentify why a kid isn't going to school and you provide interventions, those interventions might inadvertently reinforce the school refusal behavior. Okay, so it's really important. Again, I'm basing this on Carney. I'm an attorney. I'm not an educator. I'm not a researcher. But what Carney will say is that it's really important to understand the basis for the school refusal before you program, because otherwise you're going to make it worse. Okay, so these four categories are the big ones that he identifies. He also, if we go to the next slide, Carney talks about, he offers some definitions. He talks about school refusal as anxiety-based absenteeism. School phobia is fear-based absenteeism. Um, Separation anxiety, he talks about, difficulty separating from parents in key situations. And truancy is broadly the illegitimate or illegal absence from school without parental knowledge. Um, that gets into the playing hooky part, which is again what we're not talking about. So we're really not focusing on truancy. We're talking about absenteeism. On the next slide, if we could. PDE offers its own explanation or its own definitions as well. What I do in this presentation is I want to use PDE's resources. Pennsylvania Department of Education offers a lot of resources. There's a school attendance toolkit, improvement toolkit that's offered. There is a basic education circular, which we're going to talk about, which talks about policies that PDE recommends that schools and parents follow when dealing with these issues. The reason why I think it's helpful to understand these resources is when you walk into an IEP meeting and you say, I have a good idea, here it is. That can be persuasive, but it's really reliant on how clearly you can argue your position to be persuasive about your good idea. But if you walk in and say, I have a basic education circular that says we should take these steps, that's persuasive. And frequently IEP meetings, uh, we all know sometimes they go really well, sometimes they're contentious. If you are advocating for a kid with a disability and you are talking about what Pennsylvania has recommended a process as being, it sort of takes you out of the hot seat and says, look, this is what the state says. I'm not saying this. This is what the state says. Maybe we give this a try. And that, and you know, it's important to understand that these resources are out there. Frequently, school districts don't know about these resources. And I am incredibly sympathetic to the slew of problems that school personnel deal with on a regular basis. I think that there is frequently not enough professional development time for people. They have so many obligations and funding is so low. Frequently, we end up talking about new issues when we talk about some of these PDE documents or we're introducing these for the first time. When that happens, I'm going to be very clear with parents about this. Parents, you're not helping your case if you embarrass anyone for not knowing about this stuff. Okay. These are really complicated issues. And I think that approaching the IEP team with humility and saying, look, and don't say, I don't know why you didn't know this, obviously, but instead saying, look, I found this resource and I think it might be helpful in addressing my kid's situation or the kid for whom I'm advocating situation. Um, so keep that in mind that this is helpful as well. We're going to move on to the next slide. So I always want to sort of talk about why are we talking about this? Okay, why are we talking about chronic absenteeism? Why is this an issue that we're even addressing at all? There are certainly some kids and whose needs are so significant that absenteeism isn't the biggest deal. Okay, and I know that we're all educational professionals or parents who care about education, but there are some kids who, their needs are so significant, school attendance isn't the highest need. I'm not talking about those kids. I'm talking about kids um, uh, who have the ability to go to school and have the ability to learn and have aren't prohibited by reasons of their disability or life circumstances for participating in school programming. And for those kids, chronic absenteeism, kids who are chronically absent, they don't learn to read, lower academic performance long term, more likely to drop out. And the statistics about what the long-term effects are for chronic absenteeism for adults is really sort of scary too. Increases the risk of substance use disorder, involvement with the criminal justice system. You have worse health, you've got worse mental health, you've got worse jobs, and you're more likely to live in poverty. This is all from the PDE's school attendance toolkit. This is again, this ain't me saying this, folks. This is what PDE says. So this is why these issues are so important and why we want to focus on them to the degree that we do. Next slide talks about, and this is just something I found that is cool. The more years a kid is absent from school or has chronic absenteeism, the worse the outcomes are. So, if you can see if you have chronic absenteeism for under a year, you have a 10% chance of dropping out. If you're chronically absent for 2 years, that jumps to 50%. Okay, so this is a real issue with real significance. On to the next slide, if we could. So before we get into interventions and talking about sort of how we program for this uh, for absenteeism, I think it's important for people to know what the law is in Pennsylvania because this isn't just a special education issue. Usually, attendance it has nothing to do with the office of with the director of special education. Usually, that's handled by another segment of the school's administrative team. It can be a principal, an assistant principal, an assistant superintendent, but it's not a disability based it's not school attendance is usually not a disability based focus for administrators. And so it's important to understand what the principal is worried about in terms of what his expectations are for kids showing up at school. Um, the The resource that I give a number of resources that, or I think I offer the basic education circular. It's basic education circulars for parents. I know professionals will know this. Basic education circulars are a summary of Pennsylvania law that applies to a certain situation. This is very useful for you when you're advocating. I'm going to go on to the next slide, though, and just summarize the bullet points. Compulsory attendance between 6 and 18. Excused absence or when a student is prevented from attendance for mental, physical, or other urgent reasons. There are lawful absences if the student misses school to obtain medical care, and schools have to create their own policy, but in that policy, they should consider illness, family emergency, death of family members, medical and dental appointments, authorized school activities, and educational travel with prior approval. Those all should be considered as lawful absences. On to the next slide, if we could. Now, the district is going to create its own attendance policy, and attendance policies may differ. And it's important to understand that there are differences between each district's attendance policies for professionals. So I always recommend downloading the student handbook for a specific district to understand what their specific requirements are. Um, but it must address the maximum number of lawful absences, and the policy should state whether, what requires an excuse from a physician or medical professional. And the PDE says that in most instances, all absences are going to be treated as unlawful unless the school receives a written excuse. Um, I'm going to talk about submitting excuses in the next slide, if we could. So parents should submit a written explanation of an excuse within the defined time period in the attendance prop policy. We all know that. We also know, but the school also has an obligation to inform parents in writing on each incident, because frequently with kids, and again, I don't know if to what degree advocates have experienced this. Certainly we have in our office. But a lot of kids aren't necessarily telling their parents when they're too scared to go to school. We've had kids who hide in bathrooms. We have kids who hide in libraries. We have kids who hide in, the vestibule outside of school because they don't want to enter. So understanding that the school has an obligation to let parents know, that's an important point sometimes as well. Parents should also be informed that if a written excuse is not provided within a defined period of time, that the absence will be permanently counted as unlawful. That makes sense too. The part that I sort of think is interesting is that PDE says that if a parent is neglectful in providing a written excuse for an absence or fails to give the notice quickly, a reasonable allowance should be made to accept parents' explanations for that delay before going to court. What that starts at this point in the process is a broad reasonableness requirement for a lot of district action when it comes to truancy. This is truancy, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, if we could. Um, there's a law that was passed in 2016 that stated that traditional truancy prosecutions are disfavored and should only be used when other less punitive measures have proven unsuccessful, and that schools should exercise caution and reason when utilizing punitive measures and initiating compulsory attendance proceedings. This is important, folks. And part of the reason why this is important is if you've got a kid who has a disability, and that kid is the thing we know, if we've dealt with this professionally or personally, is that if you have a child who is refusing to go to school, this is upending your entire family's life. Nothing is okay in your family because every morning you are having a negotiation, an argument, a bargaining session, a screaming session for some families about whether your kid is going to go to school or not, and how to get your child to school. So frequently, when parents are under a high level of stress when they're dealing with it in the first place, having a truancy letter sent is a huge trigger for those families. Okay. Then having a referral to the local district magistrate is also a huge, a huge, um, a huge factor in increasing the anxiety of these families. Getting a criminal citation, especially when parents can be charged with truancy, students can be charged with truancy, that the charge itself, when you get it in the mail, it will talk about jail time. Okay, parents don't, and for a lot of parents who don't get traffic tickets, don't get parking tickets, getting a letter in the mail that they are going to be subject to a proceeding where they may be subject to jail time or a huge fine, that is going to increase the anxiety level. So keeping in mind that schools should exercise caution and reason, especially before proceeding to compulsory attendance hearings, that makes sense in terms of trying to solve the problem and in trying to reduce the level of stress that parents have. So I think that's an important thing to know when you're advocating for a family or your own family in this situation, is that that this isn't a mechanical process where a student misses 10 days of school, it automatically goes to the district justice. It is not that rigid, it is not that inflexible, and the process should be looked at and we're going to talk about this more, taking into consideration all sorts of factors which are impacting the student's attendance. The next slide, if we could. Thank you. So when a student misses, so the there's another resource, and I think I've been seeing some links being shared on the chat bar. Um, we talked about this before, or I don't think we did talk about this. Schools must notify a parent within 10 days of the child's third unexcused absence. And that parental notice has to explain consequences, and sometimes it will offer what's called a school attendance improvement conference, SAIC. And then if absences continue after that notice, the school must provide an the school is required to provide an SAIC if absenteeism continues past the that 3 day after the letter goes out. The next slide, if we could. The school attendance improvement conference is a meeting where a kid's absences and the reasons for the absences are examined in order to improve attendance. And the goals are to get a parent support and to figure out and to document what the school's attempts are to solve the problem. So this is sort of it's a brainstorming session, and it's sort of a little bit like an IEP meeting, okay, or a 504 meeting. Schools can't initiate truancy proceedings until this SAIC meeting is held, and it should be addressing comprehensively the 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 entire history of school attendance issues. It doesn't need to be just that year. It should be talking broadly about a student's needs. If we can go to the next slide. So it should include the student, and for kids with anxiety, that can be a huge problem. Okay, so that is something that I would encourage if you are having a meeting and the school is insistent about the child coming and the child has anxiety about coming to school. I would talk about having a Zoom meeting. I would talk about having the kid participate virtually, or trying to figure out something besides forcing the student to come. Um, the parents, appropriate school personnel will be there. Um, Recommended service providers. Sometimes the school will bring in their own mental health or behavioral health team that they work with. But the cool thing that I see in the law for regarding SAIC participants is that parents can bring in their mental health providers, their physicians, or educational advocates to help address these problems. Um, on the next slide, if we could. The school attendance improvement plan is the document that should come out of one of these meetings. It should the team must document the what the plan looks like. It should talk about the an assessment of what the academic and social and health school supports are that the student receives in and out of school. It will talk about what are parent responsibilities. It will talk about student responsibilities. It also talks about performance monitoring that includes rewards and consequences. Again, this is a lot like a positive behavioral support plan. There are opportunities. This is an opportunity for all of us who advocate in IEP meetings to sort of use our IEP meeting advocacy skills outside of that IEP setting. There are areas of need that must be included in the school attendance improvement plan. Areas of need, those are present levels of functional performance, folks. Those are stuff we all know about. They talk about solutions. That's the equivalent of related services and specially designed instruction. They are also directed to use a specific form and that requires you to have that conversation. I'm sorry, it requires you to use this form or an equivalent of that form. And the reason why that form is valuable because it gives you a structure to go through the meeting and avoid having it turn into parents, why aren't you getting your kid to school? Okay. Frequently, these school districts again are overburdened. They will have half a dozen attendance improvement conferences a week, and they sometimes they go on autopilot by bringing in the form and asking the team to go through each element. You're slowing the process down. You're trying to get people to understand that this is a joint responsibility to get a student to school, and it also helps prompt conversations to think about solutions in a productive way. So regardless of whether you're a professional or a parent, if you're trying to solve this problem, it gives this document, this model document, this model form, it gives a good structure to go through these conversations. If we could hit the next slide, please. So we're going to I talked a little bit about the basic education circular. The basic education circular regarding school attendance says that if a student with a disability is truant or chronically absent, the school should, and this isn't may, the school should convene the student's IEP team to determine whether revisions to the IEP are necessary or appropriate. That makes sense. Okay. Schools frequently do not do this. Um, sometimes getting an IEP meeting. First off, there's frequently conversations about whether this is an IEP meeting, whether this is an IEP issue at all. That language helps a parent argue, yes, this is something that the school team should be taking into consideration. We'll talk about other cases and some hearing officer decisions which back this up in reality as well. But in under the law and under the guidance offered by PDE, the school should be um, reconvening the IEP team to talk about these issues. This is not, and if these are urgent issues, and if there's a sense of urgency about the student missing school, then I think you can use that sense of urgency to get a quick IEP team meeting set up for the kid who's missing. The the other provision is when you do call an IEP meeting, they want the administrator responsible for handling truancy in the IEP meeting. Okay. That makes sense too, because what we want to do is to have both the disability based system and the school attendance system, which is not disability based. We want people to talk to each other and not talk past each other and to work collaboratively to try to find a solution together. Um, let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that the basic education circular also does is that it recognizes absenteeism accommodations. And an accommodation is something which says, based upon a student's disability, we're going to change our regular policy and we're going to do something differently because of the student's disability. That this is a reasonable accommodation to a student's disability. There's a long line of case law under the IDA, Section 504, Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, for these sorts of accommodations. Um, and what the accommodation can look like is just the student is excused from missing school entirely, that there can be a period of time where the student isn't going to be able to attend school. We all know this. Okay, if a student is in a car accident or if a student has a major health concern or something else like that, we all understand that for chronic health reasons, kids don't go to school. With kids with concussions frequently, which can be a disability issue, but frequently happen to kids without disabilities. When a kid has a concussion, a disability, their absenteeism is going to be excused. What the Beck says is a student with a disability who is truant or chronically absent for health related reasons must still provide a valid excuse, which may excuse which may include a written excuse from a physician. However, schools must recognize that students' disabilities may present unique circumstances that might require consideration of other statutory or regulatory provisions or attendance policies. So, what they're talking about is that the IEP team, if a kid is too anxious to go to school, there can be an accommodation where they can say, well, we're going to keep trying to get the kid to school. We're going to mark the kid absent, but we're not going to be sending the kid to a magistrate hearing or prosecuting this matter. Um, the policy also talks about the IDA, Section 504 of the ADA, may require the school to otherwise diverge from its general attendance policy in order to ensure that all students with a disability are provided with PAPE. This is really explicit stuff that the state is saying, which parents, if you were to bring this up to if most parents were going to try to bring this up to an IEP meeting, they would be probably viewed with a lot of disagreement. Again, walking into an IEP meeting with the basic education circular, which explicitly says we need to talk about very accommodating the student from the attendance policy, using that language and the state's guidance and direction, that can be helpful in trying to de-escalate a lot of these problems. On the next page, though, if we could, but getting these accommodations, which permit a kid, the school to not enforce its attendance policies, I mean, it avoids truancy, but you're really getting into a lot of other problems. For kids who are anxious and don't want to go to school because they are anxious about school, which is the biggest issue we see, by having a kid stay home and giving the kid license to stay home, you are providing reinforcement for the child being at home. Okay. And one of the things which we really want to avoid doing is providing further reinforcement for that disability related behavior, which is causing the absenteeism. The kid's not learning. If the kid, when if there's no contact with peers, there's isolation, and for the most part, the impact the uh, of the absenteeism, it's not you're relieving yourself from some of the legal consequences, and you're relieving the school of having to uh, you know fight about this issue as frequently, but it's not really solving the underlying issue. And so that's why I think that while it can be useful, it's not a panacea. It's not a cure-all for all the problems for kids who miss school. Um, if we go to the next. So the Beck goes on to talk about how school refusal is an IEP team problem. If a student with a disability is truant, and they'll say truant, okay? So even though I'm saying we're not really going to be talking that much about truancy, we're focusing on chronic absenteeism. Either way, The school should convene the student's IEP team to determine whether the IEP needs to be revised. We talked about this a little bit before. Schools frequently don't believe it's an IEP team issue. It's persuasive to know about this law, but it's also really useful for especially advocates, okay? Because advocates will sometimes talk outside of IEP team meetings with school personnel. Sometimes parents will advocate via email to school administrators. It's important to know that this isn't just guidance that doesn't have teeth. There's actual cases which hearing officers have recognized that absenteeism is an IEP team problem. Um, I I have provided a number of summaries of cases. Mandy, I think we're scheduled to go for an hour. Do I have that right? Okay, I'm not going to go deep on this, folks, but these cases are from the Office for Dispute Resolution. The Office for the Dispute Resolution, they handle what everyone will talk about as being due process cases. Um, excuse me. These cases, if you just enter this information, you will get the case through ODR. You'll get a PDF of the redacted decision, and you can use this to advocate further and say, my kid's situation is like the kid in this case. But these are situations where the school was found to have violated a student's right to a free and appropriate public education by either not addressing the behavior, not taking the behavior into consideration for the IEP team at all, or not doing enough. And so I would urge everybody to take a look at these summaries. If you want to Google them and download them and read them, they can be very, very useful. So these are real tools that you have when you are addressing these issues, either for yourself or with the families that you support. So I think that getting these cases and, frequently you'll have an IEP meeting. The IEP team meeting doesn't go the way that you would hope that it goes. And maybe that the IEP team is continuing to put the entire burden of school attendance on the parents. What I've recommended to advocates is hey, send them a couple of these cases and saying, look, I'm not saying this is going to go to due process. I want to make sure that you understand that somebody besides me says this is the IEP team's job to take into consideration. Um, we, I was talking to Mandy. We take all sorts of cases. We will represent parents in all sorts of situations. We're really, really busy. If I can advocate, and I like to work, but if we can give parents tools to help de-escalate these situations, um, we're not hurting our business. There's plenty of business out there. We want to make sure that parents have these tools available to them so that they can try to de-escalate these situations and they don't need to go to an attorney, they don't need to go to an advocate. And sometimes sharing these cases can be really, really helpful. So I want to talk about this, and I'm going to jump up ahead to the slide which says addressing school refusal within the IEP. Thank you to whomever is quickly shuffling through those slides. So one of the things we're going to talk about in our remaining time is how to address this with interventions. Okay. Um, this is all based on that Carney book, Helping School Refusing Children and Their Parents. Everything that I'm talking about in this section is in that book in depth. I would recommend that everybody, if this is something that you're dealing with, that you get the book, that you go more in depth than I'm going to be even capable of. I'm just scratching the surface on this. But the cool thing is that the book will help you understand how we address the cause of the school refusal, and we've got those four categories. We've talked about why it's important to understand it and why it is important in terms of understanding the cause before you start offering interventions. Now, the cases that we blew through and I didn't talk about, a lot of them will talk about how a functional behavioral assessment is an appropriate intervention for a student with school refusal. A functional behavioral assessment is an evaluation that can be conducted by a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst, or by a school psychologist or a counselor. But they're not, the thing I found is initial FBAs, there's a couple problems with them. They take a long time. They're an evaluation. They take 60 days after you sign the permission to reevaluate. So it doesn't give you it doesn't give immediate help. Um, it is also, you don't know how good of an FBA you're going to get until you get it. Okay, some of them are really great, some of them are really not great, and so relying on an FBA, I think is is a long-term solution. It's not a short-term solution, and that's why I like, if we go to this next slide, this scale that's called the school refusal assessment scale. Mary Lou, I see another typo here. I've got to do better on this. I apologize to everyone. Mary Lou, let's make sure I go through these again. Because I was working on this last week and I screwed it up. So this is this is an alternative to the FBA, which takes a long time. The school refusal assessment scale revised, child and parent versions, 24 questions, easy completion and scoring. And my recommendation is you use this while if there's an FBA taking place, you do this before the FBA is completed, and you can do this before you even walk into an IEP meeting. Okay, this is meant to be completed by lay people. And again, if you're walking into an IEP meeting and you're offering this sort of an idea, it's very important for parents and advocates to give a heads up to the school district that this is something you're going to be talking about. What's the average time for most IEP meetings? An hour. If you are arguing about whether this is a real intervention or if this is a valid use of the IEP team's time, you're not going to get to substance. You can start doing a little bit of the work of sort of talking about this intervention. You can start doing that in advance of the IEP meeting. And I would encourage parents to start emailing about this and advocates to emailing well before the IEP meeting actually takes place. If you look at the next slide, if we could. So it's one of those sort of bubble scales where you fill them out, and this is it's really straightforward, and I don't usually get this in depth, but it sort of asks real questions. It asks oh, I forgot this. You've got a copy of this as well. We include this questionnaire, and I think the scoring sheet is also included there. The What this questionnaire does is you fill out these 24 questions. As a parent, a teacher could figure it out. I think I'm sorry. I think it's primarily a parent and a child. And then if we go to the next slide, there's this really simple way of scoring it where there's four different sort of reasons why kids miss school. Each of these columns turns out matches up with one of these reasons. So you put the score numbers into each of these columns, and what it will do is, if we go to the next page, each column will correlate with one of the four functions of school refusal. And if you share, and what this lets us do is get an understanding of, is this a kid who's there because they don't want to separate from their parent? Is this an issue regarding social situations? Is this about school stress? And then you can start talking about interventions. If we could go to the next page, if we could. Um, so Carney distinguishes between negatively reinforced and positively reinforced school refusal behavior. If we go to the next page, and again, I hate it that we're dealing with this as late as we are, because this is a lot of these are a lot of this is where a lot of the discussion that when I've done this training previously, where we've wanted to talk more about this, and I'm not doing anything until 12, folks. I'm happy to stay late. If people want to stay late, I'll talk forever.
We're fine to go as long as you'd like. And
Awesome. Okay.
if people have to leave, we'll have the recording to email out. So
Thank you, Mandy. And folks, I want to respect everyone's time, and I know other people have professional and personal obligations, but this is this is an important discussion because um, this is part of the read the book today, implement it tomorrow. This is what we talk about the implementation as being. These interventions are the things that you're going to add to the IEP or add to your child's life outside of the IEP team setting to help them address this issue. Um, so for the interventions for negatively reinforced school refusal, this is for kids who get scared at school for different reasons. They talk about student education for anxiety and distress, which talks about the physical and cognitive and behavioral components. A lot of schools have providers who will offer cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy in the school setting, or they'll have social workers or therapists who even if they're not using those particular methodologies, they can talk about sort of how to manage physical feelings of anxiety, about breathing, about muscle relaxation. You can, and again, I understand this is therapy in some ways, but it's also what social workers in school settings do, and it's what emotional support teachers in school settings do because they're reinforcing things that have been taught in a therapeutic setting. Teaching kids how to manage irrational thoughts by identifying irrational thoughts and developing more realistic thoughts, and setting up a time for a student to work through those um, those feelings and those thoughts on a regular basis. We frequently like doing something called an emotional check-in. Okay. Where a student will start their day meeting a preferred adult and then talk about, what they might be anxious during the course of the day, how they're going to deal with it, being reminded about, rational and irrational thoughts as much as you do for a kid at their developmental level, talking about breathing and relaxation. And those sort of interventions can work really well. And if you get the school to buy in and assign personnel, which is, I always think the biggest issue is getting somebody who's actually going. I mean, it's great to have something in the IEP, but you actually need someone to implement it. And so making sure that it's not just in the IEP, but there is a specific individual or individuals responsible for supporting the student. These sorts of things can make a big difference. Um, so adding to the IEP team, IEP, the provision of therapy, social work, counseling services, that's a big deal. That can really be helpful. Sometimes parents and don't know how to manage their kid when their kid doesn't want to go to school. The really rarely used parent training related service, I think is fantastic in this situation. We're going to call the parents in and or have a Zoom meeting with them, and we're going to come up with a plan on we're going to educate the parents on how they're going to be able to support the school, what the efforts the school is making so that everybody's on the same page on getting the kid to school every day. Um, you want the other so parent training I think can really be useful, and I think you can use whatever the supports are that the family has in terms of private clinical supports along with school supports. If you enter this as in good faith and say let's get together, let's talk, and let's try to solve this problem. In many instances, just getting that meeting of the minds and having people start paying more attention to the students' disability related needs, which are causing the absenteeism, that in and of itself, we find frequently makes a big difference. Coordinating with existing therapeutic providers is a big deal too, folks. So I think that if having parent signing releases of information so that the IEP team can talk to the therapist and the therapist can talk to the school and have them sort of develop a plan together, that makes a great deal of sense from our perspective as well. Um, Kearney, at the next slide, we can talk about the gradual reintegration into the school setting. This is something that gets tried a lot, but unless there are supports, the gradual reintegration won't. I mean, sometimes it works, But unless what we find is that unless there are additional supports, the gradual reintegration doesn't work because the kid develops the same fears and negative associations with school that they had before. So it's important. So gradual reintegration is a good idea, starting the kid off at first thing in the morning, and then or later in the afternoon, or during a preferred class, or during lunch. Um, you know, all of these can be worked out based upon what the parents and the school side think is a good plan. Um, Consider starting in a non-classroom setting. I think that's a really good recommendation. Have the kid start in a setting where he or she can meet with a preferred adult and get, or it can be, a lunch lady, it can be an office administrator, it can be the school resource officer or the guy who works the metal detectors. It doesn't matter. Getting the student with somebody where they're comfortable with is also really useful. Um, the other thing that they talk about though is you don't want to make school super fun, or you don't want to make skipping school fun. So what I will tell parents to do is you're shutting off the router for your house when you leave school every day. When you leave for work, and if your kid is there because you can't get your kid to school, you're disconnecting the internet. You are, and so whatever is going to be going on that you're dealing with, or what, or you're not going to be inadvertently reinforcing that school refusal behavior. For kids with medical absences, they talk about setting criteria for this, but but I'm sorry, that was inarticulate. For kids with medical needs, schools frequently will send children home because of their medical needs. And that is another way to allow a student to manipulate the system to avoid school. So what frequently we'll talk about is that the kid might go to the nurse, and somatization is part of anxiety and mental health conditions. We're going to bring the nurse in and say, look, every time the kid comes to you, you're not going to send the kid home the way that you would for a typically developing student, because this is part of their mental health condition. um, so making sure that the kid doesn't get sent home for health reasons, which are really manifestations of anxiety, that's important to seal that up too, because otherwise that's going to be a loophole that the student's going to find. Same thing for discipline. Okay. If a kid figures out that every time I flip the table, my mommy comes and picks me up, they are figuring out how to avoid school. So you want to be very cognizant of the ways that uh, this the school refusal behavior gets reinforced by carrying out the same policies that are used for typically developing kids when they're sick, or when they are get in trouble or get suspended at school. So we would want the IEP team to take that into consideration as well. Um, for On the next slide, if we could. Um, a lot of kids, and this is not Carney necessarily. Some of it is, some of it's our own experience in terms of figuring out how to address situations. If you've got a kid who is aversive to school because of social situations, the things we've found are really useful is decreasing the level of unstructured and unsupervised time the student has. Increase the level of supervision. You want to increase, have some, what we'll say is, who's got eyes on the student, who's responsible for watching this student. Because, and then not just watching the student, but also being trained that if what a negative social situation looks like, if this kid is interacting with peers, and frequently we see this with kids on the spectrum, what might look like a regular, normal, non problematic social exchange between typically developing kids who are joking around, for a kid on the spectrum, that might be really disturbing for them. So, training increasing the level of supervision and training the adult on what to look for and when to intervene. If kids on the spectrum feel like they're getting teased, or they actually are getting teased, that is something that looks different, and school personnel should be aware of that. And just telling students that you've got eyes on you, this teacher, this adult, this supportive person is going to be available for a resource for you if if you start getting uncomfortable, that can help as well. Um, the other thing that really we want to address is what happens when kids miss school, and what happens when they return back to school. When you have a kid who is scared of school and scared of taking tests at school, and that kid, misses a week of attendance, and then finally shows up on Monday morning and gets handed a stack of work that is due from the previous week, that is going to undermine any good that probably has been done previously. It is going to be a setback. So, planning for not just the reduction of the work, but also planning for the provision of makeup instruction is important. If you miss the first, 5 lessons on fractions, and then you are expected to, when you show up at school and you're expected to learn how to do work with fractions, that is going to be anxiety provoking for many students. So, understanding how to manage homework, understanding how to manage missed instruction, making sure that the kid doesn't have a quiz as when the kid shows up at school and the kid sits down and guess what? Here's the quiz on the last unit. You just try your best. Teachers will say things like that. It doesn't matter. That's going to be through our own experience. We know that's going to be a problem. And talking about these issues in advance is super important. The reason why it's so important to talk about them in advance is because when they go wrong and you have to fix them afterwards, it takes a month. Okay. Getting an IEP meeting quickly, getting everyone on the same page after something happens is another. I said a month, it might be less, it might be more, but during that period of time, the student continues to not attend school. Students' sort of anxiety continues to cycle and increase, and it's harder to fix this. The thing we've also found is for kids on the spectrum, this is incredibly important. For many kids on the spectrum, if they get burned once, they will never trust it again. Okay. You have exactly one chance to get it right for many kids where they lose faith with an individual, or they lose faith in a setting. So it's very important to get to address these sort of issues in the IEP meeting in advance because they are predictably going to go wrong. And this is something where we're talking with whoever your support team is. Go through your kid's day. Go through play out what a student's reintegration is going to look like, and go through each section of the school day. Is the school bus scary? Is the transition in from the bus to school, which is an unstructured environment where a lot of crazy stuff happens? it, you have to identify each step where a student can feel anxiety, and understand that if there's a need there that you don't program for, that's going to eventually be something that you're going to have to clean up down the road. um Look, I see this, consider typical FBA questions. The functional behavioral assessment that Patton offers, their model form is really, really smart because it addresses a lot of issues that districts, don't have the time to get into. Um, One of the preliminary considerations for an FBA is whether a student has academic skill deficits. What we frequently find out is that some of these kids who are really anxious about going to school, they can't read. Okay. So it's not just that they're anxious about school, but they're anxious about not being able to do the work. They're anxious about looking different than their peers. So getting an understanding of And again, sometimes work refusal is I'm not doing that work or I act out. Sometimes it's not the response to, to feeling bad about not being able to do schoolwork is simply not going. So getting an understanding of the student's academic levels and making sure they're in line with what's being offered for the kid, that's super important too. The thing that I will remind parents about is that if you've got a kid who is reading a couple years below or has a reading comprehension level that's a couple years below their peers, it's a big deal, and it's more of a big deal than we think it is. School textbooks, this is always a trick question I like. Fifth grade school textbooks are not written on a fifth grade instructional level. They are frequently written on a seventh grade, 2 to 3 years in advance, because they're trying to convey information and they're densely packed with knowledge. So if you've got a kid who's 2 years behind and they're getting a text which is 2 years ahead, they're really going to struggle. So you've got to figure out, are you getting audio books? Are you getting school notes? Is there some alternative means of getting instruction? Other typical FBA questions that we want to address are, is this a sensory issue? Is this about fear of fire drills? Which a lot of kids on the spectrum who have sensory needs, if they are caught in a couple fire, like one fire drill, they are in perpetual fear of that sensory event happening again, and that can be a reason why they refuse to go to school. Think about sensory needs. And just think about, the typical needs that students have when transitioning from a preferred activity to a non-preferred activity. Home is preferred, school is non-preferred. If you use a typical PBSP approach, you're going to be providing some sort of positive reward, some sort of consequence, some sort of benefit for the student to reinforce the replacement behavior. If you so come up with a meaningful reinforcement for every time the kid goes to school, what do they get? For little kids, do they get a sticker every 15 minutes when they are in school and it's a different sticker and it's really cool? That's a great idea. For older kids, okay, is this sort of like, hey, you want 3 hours of screen time this weekend? Here's how you earn it over the by attending by coming up with a reinforcer that's going to be useful that and meaningful to the student. Um, I am a big believer that cell phone usage is a really important motivator, especially for teenage kids. Um, I would advise people to use good judgment with that, but I think that if cell phones are so addicting for everybody, that they sort of positively reinforce kids staying at home. That goes along with, the cell phone and turning off the internet when kids aren't going to school. That's something I always urge our clients to explore as well. Um, if we can move on to the next slide. So this is for, there's also interventions, which, and again, we have less experience with this, but I'm going to hit this just because, for the sake of completion. Um, for kids who are so positively reinforced by their parents and their home life that they are refusing to go to school. It's not that there's anything bad about school, it's just everything's great at home. There's a different procedure outlined in Carney's book. He'll talk about instituting a morning routine, a clear step-by-step schedule, where there's going to be brief commands and praise for following the routine, planned ignoring for tantrums and negative behaviors, a consequence system like we talked about a little bit earlier. And again, if this is something that the IEP team wants to try, this is another opportunity for parent training. Okay, because frequently parents aren't going to have their own knowledge. Maybe their therapy team might, but frequently schools are going to have better ideas on how to do these sort of things than schools are. Um, the last the last slide is, when do you forcing students to go to school? Okay. Every year I get a couple of cases where the school and where the situation has become so unbearable that through either the school putting pressure on the parents or the parents putting pressure on themselves, that they are going to grab the kid and they are going to force the student to go to school. Carney really discourages this because um, the reason why is because it's not maintainable. It is not maintainable to do this every time. And if your kid figures out that, if you that you don't have the ability to withhold to force school attendance each time, um, then they've succeeded in sort of wearing you down, and that further reinforces their belief that they can not attend school without consequence. He'll talk about it in certain situations where the kid's under 10, there's no distress about attending school, and that the kid is only refusing for attention. If the kid's has distress in going to school, Carney says don't ever force it. You want to make sure the student understands the consequences of refusing school. And this has got to be a situation where they're refusing so much school that it's really important. There's got to be two adults who are doing it, one to drive, one to manage the kids. And there's got to be a transition plan for the student. In reality, though, I'm sort of talking about this. I've never done this. Okay, we've generally found this to be a bad idea, but I think in general, this is something that parents want to talk about and think about. So we want to cover it here. I think I've covered a little. I went a little bit long, and I think that's our last slide. Um, I'm happy to hang out and talk about. We can conclude the recording, and if we are concluding, I'll thank everyone for their time. But I am